Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And as I say every day, I love this time with you. I thank you for joining me. And if you'd like to join the conversation directly, no matter what platform you're watching this on, you should be able to type your questions or comments on that platform, and they will appear here in my chat room, and we can interact almost as if we were in the same room. And I find that probably the most enjoyable part of this daily broadcast. Being able to spend time with you, to connect with you, and to actually speak to you. At some point, we may have more of a practice of bringing people on camera. I'm not sure I could do that at this point. I don't know how, if I can, but that may come in the future. But for now, we can speak through the chat room. And hello to Janet in the chat room. Good to see you, Janet. And what a beautiful picture of the moon Janet has for her, what would you call it? Well, for her photo. I'm sure it's been there, but I just now actually noticed it. It's lovely. You know, speaking of atmospheric phenomena, here in Danville yesterday, we were really experiencing the haze from the northern fires and very bad air quality. By the end of the day, and you know, it's been fairly warm here. We had the air conditioner going. In the evening, I had to turn it off because the house was filling with smoke. And this really is something to remind us of how interconnected we truly are. And hello to Michael in the chat room. Good to see you, Michael. Just because something isn't in the next town over doesn't mean it's not going to affect us. And we should know that because historically we've seen it time and again, but we forget. You know, we are one Earth, and just because something is over there, so to speak, doesn't mean it's not also going to come right over here. Historically, we've had this happen many times where an occurrence in one part of the world, such as a volcano erupting, has influenced areas far away, or a tsunami. And so you'd think we'd be conscious of it, but we're not. And you know, the question was asked of me yesterday, not on the broadcast, but later in the day, you know, what happens when we have forest fires in California, for example, and other places in our western states? Where does that smoke go? We never seem to hear about that. But, you know, this should remind us it must go somewhere. And it must have a similar effect to what this is doing, proportionate to size. And you know, these things affect people not just in the area. This is one reason we should try to work together more than we do to be prepared for such things and to have ways of answering them historically. Similar situations, worse than this, but similar, have caused great economic and social destruction when they spread across the world. There's the famous year without a winter, which I mentioned, year without a summer, which I mentioned yesterday, in which the skies were so clouded due to I believe, a volcanic incident, that there effectively was no summer that year and very little sunlight. And it really was a problem. As you can imagine, for people, but they did survive. Krakatoa is another example of something that was felt around the world, and you know, these things aren't really even that rare. It's just rare that we really notice. So that's something that I want to use this format to call attention to. That you know, we do live in one environment here. And Magical Mermaid, hello Magical Mermaid, it's good to see you. And refers to Wakari 2019. The Wakari White Island eruption was the beginning of Australian fires and pandemic, in their opinion. And yet there are many effects of these things. And when it comes also to disease, we can run around pointing fingers about where a particular disease may have started, such as the bubonic plague, but it's where it spreads that we need to keep our eye on. And diseases do not respect borders, neither do natural disasters. And in fact, a lot of things don't, and we need to be mindful of that. Magical Mermaid says it's a great energetic purging. Well, that's true. And I talk a lot about the turning of the age, and that part of that is an energetic purge and healing. So I suppose at a level, that's what we're seeing. But that doesn't mean that we should not do what we can do to ameliorate our situations. But yes, I'm sure it is part of a planetary cleansing. And of course, we want to make sure that the planet does not feel it needs to cleanse us at the same time. I've never been a believer in that future. Lady Bitterwind, however, definitely was. I've always thought it was the greatest irony. Lady Bitterwind spent her life waiting for the killer virus that would wipe out society, and then died right before the great pandemic of our time. I can only imagine what she would have thought had she lived to see it. Although, we were talking about this in my seminar the other day. It is possible there's also a cause and effect there, and that while she anticipated this, she didn't really want to see it. And her higher self removed her so that she would not have to. That's possible too. Lady Bitterwind also had an interesting theory about the year 2000, that all kinds of people were looking at the year 2000, and also some years to either side, for various prophetic reasons. And she thought one of the reasons that human population may have swelled so greatly was all the souls wanting to come back for that particular time period. I don't know if I agree with that, but that was certainly an idea that she held, and many of her ideas were very innovative ideas, and they always had something to them. And Magical Mermaid says, wonderfully ironic, and yes, it was. And irony is one of those things that we often see in places where, well, obviously, we don't expect it. Or I would say, obviously. So I want to today talk about the Indiegogo campaign for Psychic Academy, which you can find at psychicacademy.co. And this is our newest project, the next big thing, a school of the psychic arts. And I will be one of the major teachers at this school, not the only one, but I will be doing 3 years of classes at this school, initially live instruction. And you can learn more at psychicacademy.co. And there are a number of levels of perks to the Indiegogo campaign, which also have to do with what you can expect from the school when it's set up. We have the seeker level, the core curriculum, and the core curriculum for 1 year it is $29. The lifetime membership is $99 for the core curriculum specifically. And mentor groups, which include the core, the lifetime, and the mentor group for $199, and the mastermind program for $299. All of which is explained on the page, but that's what we're looking at. And I think it's very exciting, and I'm very excited to get back into focusing on the psychic arts. I certainly never left that focus behind entirely, because teaching about magic and metaphysics, it's hardly separate from the psychic arts. But where you put your focus is always specific to your situation. I taught a lot about the psychic arts in teaching about magic and Correllian clergy training, but there's certainly more that can be taught when we focus specifically on the psychic arts, and the higher reaches of that curriculum will deal with the psychic arts in a more professional context, which is of interest even if you're not looking to make it a profession, because those considerations affect any psychic practice if you're wanting to do it in depth, even if you're preferring to keep it on a non-financial level. But learning the difference between just reading for fun, reading for people in a context such as reading in a bookstore or reading at a psychic fair, or other professional settings, working with companies and corporations, they all bring in their own issues, which will be part of that training. And of course, the psychic arts themselves. And if you were to take all 3 degrees of Correllian Wicca, you would have quite a background in the psychic arts. But much of that comes in the more advanced training there. And so we'll be going over some of the things that are there, but also many things that are not. And the psychic arts are a fascinating subject, and learning to do them is fascinating. And I do want to emphasize that the point of this is not just to learn some interesting things about the psychic arts and what people think about the psychic arts, but to learn to practice them in a real-time way. Regardless of how you're doing it, whether you're doing it professionally, whether you're doing it personally, but to actually be able to do it. There's not much point otherwise. In my opinion, we want people to actually learn how to pursue the psychic arts. So I encourage you to check out psychicacademy.co and maybe get a head start on membership, and to support us in bringing it into fruition. There are certainly a number of things that need to be done. A certain amount of investment is necessary, and your early support would be very helpful. So again, psychicacademy.co. And of course, speaking of support and investment, if you want to support me personally, you can always join my Patreon at revdonlewis.com, where we have a number of different perks as well, ranging from our Monday night chat room to our monthly newsletter, our monthly seminar, our monthly surprise offering, or even a monthly consultation. And you can find that at revdonlewis.com. And today, or rather tonight, you can find me on Tarot Tuesday at paganworldtv.co. I will be joining Reverend Mary Hawk for her weekly tarot program, which I'm a monthly guest on. And we always have fun when we do that. You can get a free mini reading if you wish to do so. It runs basically like this program. You would type in your questions, and we would do a reading for you. And one of the things that's very interesting is the rapport that Reverend Mary and I have. It's very common that sitting in different states, shuffling our cards thoroughly, but separately, obviously, we often come up with the same cards, which is a very interesting thing. I have found in my many years of working as a psychic that the level of rapport you have with different people can produce very interesting effects. I had a client at one time. I'm certainly not going to go into anything private about the relationship, but I don't think that it's private to remark that for this particular client, I was able to predict things down to the minute, which is not something I normally do or normally even try to do. But for this person, for whatever reason, that rapport was there at that level. And I was frequently amazed myself when they would say, yes, this happened just as you predicted. Normally, I don't even, as I say, try to predict things for specific times. Maybe, I mean, time of month, time of year, a certain number of weeks, yes, but 2 o'clock on Thursday is not what I normally do. But in this case, that's what would come through, and it would be correct more often than not. Of course, I would never say that things are always correct. If someone does tell you they have something like 100% accuracy, I wouldn't take that too seriously. No matter how good you are, there are going to be occasions when you are off for various reasons, including that the client may take evasive action that changes what's coming. I come from that school of thought that you should never be so sure of yourself that you fall into arrogance. And, I like to tell the story of a psychic named Deandra in the Chicago area. And we had a friend by the name of Judy, lovely lady. I don't know if she's still living. It's been long enough that she would be quite elderly if she were, but she was a beautiful person. She was part of a group that I used to read for on a weekly basis, and I would read for them for 4 and 5 hours at a time. But she invited me to her Thanksgiving dinner, and also Deandra, who was a good friend and psychic to her and her family. And during the dinner, Judy remarked that Deandra had predicted that she would, that her daughter would have become pregnant by this time, and it had not happened. And she did this in a good-natured way, and Deandra said, well, I guess I was wrong. And I've always thought that was the perfect answer. Now, the interesting follow-up is that within a week, the daughter announced that she was pregnant. So it turns out she wasn't so wrong. But the fact that she was readily willing to admit that, well, yes, this one didn't hit, that's a good sign in a psychic. Because it can happen to anyone. And it is part of being a psychic. And this is one of the things that will be discussed at Psychic Academy. How do you handle when things don't go as expected, when they don't go ideally, when you get a problem client, when you have trouble connecting, when something you've brought through turns out to be totally wrong, because that will happen. It must occasionally happen. And why does it happen? There are a number of reasons. One of them could be that you just didn't have a good connection. But as I say, it can also be things that were done afterwards. It can be a number of different things. And you must be prepared to say, well, I'm sorry, I was obviously wrong that time. Because anyone can do this. When I teach oracle work, channeling, if you would, one of the most important things I talk about is that the message can always be warped by the messenger. And you must never forget that. Bringing through an oracle is not a flawless process. Now, if you've been well trained and you're doing it well, you can bring some remarkable things through. And you should trust your track record for how likely you think they are to be, how accurate. I almost always trust what I bring through because the track record has been such that I feel that I can. But I would never say that there couldn't be one that would be wrong, because there are things that can interfere with that. When we're talking about channeling, when we're talking about psychic reading, one of the things that can interfere is if the vessel is censoring the message, intentionally or unintentionally. And how does that happen? If you're afraid of it, you may not be able to receive it, is one way you can block that message. If it's something that you just can't hear, you won't be able to get it. You must remember that. Sometimes if you're involved in the situation, you really hope for a certain outcome, and you can't set that aside to do the work, you may impose that answer. That's another way you can censor the actual message. How do you learn not to do that? Well, you have to learn to set it aside. Now, hello to Deb in the chat room. Good to see you, Deb. This is vitally important, but I would never say there's a time that you can't censor that message. Another way you can censor the message is if you just don't have the concept. Because when you receive a psychic message, any psychic message, how do you receive it? It comes down through your crown chakra, through your brain, and out your mouth, basically. It gets the words or pictures or symbols or however it's expressed to you from what you've already got. And it can sometimes put together things that you would not think of from what you've got. But if you've not got it, it can't do it. So if you want to do this kind of work, my recommendation is to be as well read as possible, to have as much command of symbolism as possible, to really expand your references as far as possible, because they will use them to communicate with you. And they'll be able to get more through. I'm put in thought of the famous writer from the ancient world who had been a priest at the Temple of Delphi, and then became what was also a very prominent writer. And he was asked why the current oracles of Delphi were not as good as the historical oracles. And his response, while a little classist, was also, I think, insightful. And that was that the more upper class, well-educated women were no longer willing to take the role because it was so taxing. And they were being forced to take whoever they could get, who usually didn't have that same level of education, which is a way of saying that they did not have the references to phrase the oracles in the way that previous oracles had been able to do, which I think is an accurate assessment. And the correct answer to that would have been to have had intensive teaching for new oracles to expand their fields of reference and their fields of symbolism. But I don't know that they thought of it in those terms, even if he did, in my opinion, correctly identify the problem. That would have been what I would have recommended. And Maggie, hello to Maggie in the chat room. It's good to see you, Maggie. And Maggie says, being an amateur reader, I got a reading wrong with harsh consequences. You know, I can only say sometimes this happens. And we have to keep trying to be as impartial as possible as we do readings. And, you know, sometimes these things are going to happen, and we can't let it stop us. And, you know, I was taught that whoever may come to you for a reading at a certain time was sent to you. And even if you turn out to be wrong, that this too is not a coincidence, that it was meant to be for some reason. And so I would add that into the conversation. So what I would say is, just be aware that sometimes this will happen. And you know, when you're talking, when you're giving a reading, I think it's always wise, particularly on monumental issues, to remind people that you know, they should take some things with a grain of salt and apply the reading according to the track record. If the things in the reading seem to be working out, they can have confidence in it. If you've worked out for them before, they can have confidence. If they're not sure, they should certainly pay attention, but also act with common sense. You should always act with common sense, no matter how good your reader is, no matter how many times you've seen them. You never throw common sense to the wind. You know, I often say that if Spirit told you to sell everything you own and buy lottery tickets, don't do that, because Spirit isn't going to tell you that. You have fudged that message. Unintentionally, of course, but don't do that. Now, if Spirit tells you to buy a lottery ticket, I would go out and buy it. But Spirit isn't going to tell you something like sell everything you own to buy lottery tickets. Although I will say, given the track record of my own guides, if I got that message, I wouldn't run out and do it. But if I got it several times, I probably would, because they've been that good. And Magical Mind says, I think people can send messages that way as well if passionate enough. And that's true too. That's another thing that can sometimes warp a message. And all of these things are worth bearing in mind, and they're part of what we're going to talk about at Psychic Academy. Not only how do you bring through the message, but how should you receive a message? And how should you encourage others to receive it? And as the unadulterated Word of God is not how you should receive it, because that's not exactly what's happening. Are you receiving a message from the universe? Yes, you are. But you are also an active participant in that process, and your limitations can also limit your message. So we'll talk a lot more about how you can avoid that and how you can apply that knowledge in a sensible way in those lessons. But it is important to know. Having said that, I find that these psychic arts are accurate more often than not, at least certainly for me and for many people I've known. But you have to remember that there are those times when, for whatever reason, the message is not going to hit exactly, may not hit at all. But I have to say that I've more often encountered the opposite situation, which is that the message does hit exactly, but not at all the way you thought. And that's always an interesting thing when it happens. The monkey's paw syndrome, for one better way to put it. Yes, it came to pass, but not the way you expected. And I've certainly seen that happen. Now, Brenda, hello Brenda, it's good to see you in the chat room. And how can you tell if it is a false oracle? And, I would have to say, if it's someone else giving it, I think you can usually tell. Certainly if they appear to be reading it, that's a bad sign. But I usually try to give the benefit of the doubt. But if we're talking about something you've brought through yourself, I would say if it's uncharacteristic, if it is drastically at variance from what you normally get, if it seems too good to be true, these are all reasons to take it with a grain of salt. I don't know that I'd ever just throw it out, however. I don't know that I would ever just make the assumption it's a false oracle. I would make the assumption I must proceed with care. And not be all in, so to speak. If something was telling me this isn't right, I would listen to that, but I would keep it in my mind just in case it in fact is right. So let's say that I did get that message to sell everything I own and buy lotto tickets. I certainly would not do that. But if it was part of a larger message and several things had already hit, I'd take it more seriously. And no matter what, I would probably go out and buy at least one, if not a few, if I had reasonable confidence. But when you take something with a grain of salt, it doesn't mean you dismiss it exactly. And, I would point out the example I gave earlier of Deandra and the pregnant daughter. Sometimes you can think it's failed and find out it did not. I once had a lady come to me at a psychic fair, not to get a reading, but to tell me about the outcome of her previous reading and how she had totally not believed me because it was something she could not imagine happening. And it was a simple thing. It was a trip across water that would be important for various reasons. And she had no occasion ever to cross water. She was an older lady. She was not traveling anywhere as a rule. And then came an unexpected trip to see her sister. And as she's going across the bridge and looks down at the river, she remembered the reading. And of course, this unexpected trip was an important one. And she realized, oh, wait a minute, this actually has happened. And hopefully the things that I told her elsewhere in that reading proved to be helpful. And I was very glad to hear this, of course, but I remembered none of it because as a rule, you don't remember what you bring through in readings. But because she told me after the fact, it was another matter. And I was very glad to hear that from her. Maybe I needed it that day for my own confidence. Maybe she needed to come and tell it to me. But for whatever reason, that's what happened. And it was a good thing and an example of the fact that sometimes when you think it hasn't worked, it may turn out that it has, but sometimes it just doesn't. And you have to accept that as part of what happens. Um, and like I say, you just do the next right thing. And if you're young in your psychic practice, that can really shake your confidence. Um, but if you've been around for a while, you know to consider this as a possibility. And for myself, when reading highly traumatic issues or potentially traumatic issues, I usually go out of my way to point out, this is what I'm getting. I'm telling you because I'm getting it. Um, and, don't go out and sell the farm. Be mindful of it, watch for it, but don't take it as, for want of a better way to put it, gospel. And this can be especially important if you're dealing with major life changes in a reading, or anything that's highly emotional. It is important to remember that you can be wrong. At the same time, you don't want to dwell on that. It's a fine line. But that's why we're going to have a whole course in the subject to talk about all the things that we have to consider when we practice as psychics, because there are so many things. So if you're interested in Psychic Academy, you can find out more at psychicacademy.co. If you're interested in my Patreon, you can find out more at revdonlewis.com. If you're interested in the books and other items from Corellian Publishing, including the Crystal Web Kit, which is one of our newest offerings, you can find out more about that at corellianpublishing.com. And I want to thank you for joining me today. I see we've come to the end of our time. And I love this time with you. I love all of you. I love talking with you. I hope that you enjoy it as well. And let us close with our prayer. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do in our lives, and we pray that you will continue with us as we go forward, hand in hand. And we ask you to keep us humble as we go forward, and to help us to remember that, yes, things do not always work out as expected or desired, and this too is part of life. And help us to take these things in stride and move with them graciously. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and with respect. And knowing you are always with us, yet from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. I love you all, and may you be blessed now and always. And I will see you tomorrow.